Hello, today I'm going to talk about my top 10 magician films. And in order to do that, we have to ask ourselves a question. And the question is, are the magicians charlatans or are they the real deal? So many of these films, the protagonists or the main characters in general are either scoundrels, mentalists, hypnotists, and some of them actually might be sorcerers hiding in plain sight. So the whole point of this list is that kind of ambiguity. You're not really sure. There will be no witch films on this list. Films like The Craft or Practical Magic or Hocus Pocus are not going to be here. There will also be no fantasy and kind of wizard films. Harry Potter, Labyrinth, Dark Crystal, those kind of films are not going to be on this list. There will be films that I think by the end, you're not really sure if the characters are actual magicians or if it's all a trick. So I'm going to start with ones that didn't make the cut. I'm just going to put this list on the screen and you can see some of the films that I was interested in but didn't really do it for me. Many of them are decent films, but either they are not ambiguous enough or they just didn't hit me the right way. These are my runners-up. I will say that Now You See Me is an interesting film, but it just doesn't have enough ambiguity. So with that said, let's get to the list. At number 10, we have the Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus from 2009, directed by Terry Gilliam and starring Heath Ledger, Christopher Plummer, and Lily Cole. A fantastical adventure that explores themes of imagination and redemption, the film follows Dr. Parnassus, who, having made a deal with the devil, offers people a chance to enter a magical mirror and experience surreal worlds of their own making. As the devil comes to collect his due, Parnassus and his troupe must navigate a series of challenges to save his daughter and redeem his soul. The first thing I'm going to say is that Heath Ledger's unfortunate death happened during the making of this movie. This was the last film that was released. A lot of people think it was The Dark Knight, but it was not. It caused a big problem for this film. They were about halfway done, and they had no lead star. So, this is the thing with Terry Gilliam films. If you know anything about him, he often struggles so much to get a film made. Maybe that's the sign of a true artist. I don't know. Many directors have to struggle, but it seems like he has to struggle way more than most directors. If you've seen the film Lost in La Mancha, you'll know how much he has struggled. Or if you know anything about the film Brazil, there's just so many struggles in his films when he's making them. In this case, he got the idea to use the actual story to kind of fix the dilemma he was in. So Johnny Depp, Jude Law, and Colin Farrell volunteered to kind of take the burden off of him by playing the same character as Heath Ledger inside this kind of magical world that is created in the film. If you've seen one of Gilliam's other films, The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, then you'll know the kind of ambiguity here. In the film, this magic mirror serves as a portal. Like many of the magicians on this list, the wizard, magician, whatever you want to call it, is in plain sight, but in this case, he's an old man hiding as a decrepit old yogi figure. He tells these kind of tall tales from his past, similar to Munchausen. Whether these are true or not, we don't really know. We think because of this devil character played by Tom Waits, this kind of Faustian bargain that he makes, that this is all real, and it could be, I don't know though. The one thing about this film is there is the real world. Like very tangibly, these characters are going through the real world. Whether the mirror is like a symbol of going into some kind of like subconscious place that the doctor can do through some kind of like hypnosis or something is a different story. I will say this, of all the films in this list, this one verges into the fantastical more than the others. This old man appearing to be weak trope is all throughout history in terms of stories, like Merlin, or as the Welsh call him, Myrddin, kind of appears as this old man that might be kind of weak but is actually very strong. Gandalf is another example. But the Doctor gets his name from Mount Parnassus, which is in Greek myth. If you've ever read the novel The Centenarian by Balzac, you'll get kind of a idea of what is going on here. It appears, according to his stories, that he is really old, hundreds of years old. Whether he is or not, don't know. Whether he's just maybe a senile old man and he's made up these stories, similar to Adventures of Baron Munchausen. Are the stories real, or are they in his mind? We don't really know. The one thing I will say about this film is it really reveals regrets and the burden of the regrets. But I think all in all, the film is interesting, but it's missing something. That's why it's at number 10 on this list. And its biggest problem, I think, is the CGI. It just looks cheap, and it takes me out of the film. If Gilliam had done these scenes, these CGI scenes, with animations like his Monty Python 2D collage animations, I think this film might have been a masterpiece. I really think he underestimated what CGI could bring to this, probably because he didn't have a lot of experience with it, and it just shows. I think it looks a little silly, and it hasn't aged well. I watched this recently again, and it just has not aged well. At number 9, we have Black Magic from 1949, directed by Gregory Ratoff and starring Orson Welles and Nancy Guild. It's a historical drama based on the life of 18th century magician and hypnotist Cagliostro. The film explores Cagliostro's rise to power and influence in European courts through his mysterious and controversial practices. As he becomes entangled in political intrigue and romantic entanglements, Cagliostro's mastery of illusion and manipulation ultimately leads to his dramatic downfall. This is an adaptation of Alexander Dumas' novel Joseph Balsamo, and it has Orson Welles in this really, really charismatic performance. He plays the 18th century mentalist and occultist Cagliostro. It's a bit over the top, but I have to say, Orson Welles, there's something about his acting where you just know he's giving it his all. You can tell he's got an enormous ego, but when he's diving into something like this, he just sells it, which I think at this time is a little bit hard to do. He carries this film, I'll just say. It does stray far from history, though. It is not even remotely close to the real story of this man. Does it matter? Not really, because it's actually a pretty interesting movie overall. It is really well done for its time, I think, as far as the budget. A film of this type usually doesn't have a large budget. It's like an occult film that's, I don't want to say exploitation a little, but it has that kind of edge. It's like, oh, here's the occult movie, it's so scary, that kind of thing. So usually those kind of films don't really have that large of a budget, but in this case, this film is beautiful. The costumes are amazing. I wouldn't be surprised if this was using costumes from another film and maybe borrowing them, I don't know. But it's filmed in lush black and white, and there is some debate about whether Welles kind of ghost directed this film because of a lot of the camera angles and the light and shadow. It almost looks like one of his films. At this time, he was kind of blacklisted from Hollywood, so who knows? But in the film, is the hypnotism real? In the movie, he's trained in the occult. He's kind of like this charlatan / rogue. They make him out to be a bit of a con man. I think the actual figure, his history is less tall tale. In this one, they have him like a gypsy and all this stuff, where in the real story, he's like this Italian guy that learns all this occult knowledge. In real life, his name is Giuseppe Balsamo. Eventually, he was known as the Count Alessandro di Cagliostro. He got embroiled in this affair of the diamond necklace, which involved the Queen Marie Antoinette and Cardinal Prince Louis de Rohan. Now, I don't know how close this is to reality, this film, but I think in the movie there's some interesting twists and stuff. I'm not gonna spoil them, but you know, it's just Wells's performance. The way the camera comes in on his eyes and his like intense stare, only Wells could pull that off, and I think he does it in spades in this film. If you're a Wells fan and you haven't seen this, you should definitely watch it. As far as whether he's real or not, in this film, it kind of makes him out to seem like he has some supernatural ability, at least as far as his animal magnetism. Whether he did in real life or not, I'm not sure. At number 8, we have Lord of Illusion's director's cut from 1995, directed by Clive Barker and starring Scott Bakula, Kevin J. O'Connor, and Famke Janssen in a dark fantasy horror film. The director's cut delves deeper into the story of private investigator Harry D'Amour, who stumbles upon a dangerous cult led by the sinister sorcerer Nyx. As D'Amour uncovers the truth behind a series of supernatural events, he must confront terrifying illusions and dark magic to save an innocent woman and stop Nyx's apocalyptic plans. This film starts with this awesome opening, and I will also say that it kind of sums up the notion of this list with this quote: "Illusions are trickery, magicians do it for real." In this film, there's a stage magician played by Kevin J. O'Connor. His stage name is Philip Swan. The film audience knows that he's hiding. The stage magician audience thinks he's a real magician. There's this prologue where he has this kind of interaction with this cult leader. All of that stuff is quite straightforward. In some ways, it even leans into supernatural elements. Maybe. Now, if you've ever done acid or any psychedelics, you know that like what you might have seen during a trip might not have been the reality of the situation. We're not really sure in this prologue if these are illusions created by the cult leader or if they're in the minds of the people that he's affecting. It's never really stated. They make you kind of want to think that he is this very powerful sorcerer. Maybe he is, but we don't know. Maybe these, maybe the sorcerer feeds all these people drugs and that's why they're seeing these things. We're not really sure. Nyx, this cult leader, is portrayed by Daniel von Bargen, and he nails this role. He is creepy, so creepy. The things about these illusions is it kind of channels this Nietzsche quote. And for better or worse, I think this film is of its time. It feels very 90s. Although I will say Clive Barker is always very interesting. If you've read any of his books, also very interesting. They're a little heavy-handed for me, but at times I appreciate what he's doing. The thing I like best about this film is the noir. It has all the noir tropes, the down and out kind of detective, the femme fatale that's in need of help, a lot of twists. I'm not going to get into them and spoil the film, but there's a lot of twists, and I think as they dive deeper into the mystery, this kind of occult mystery, it just makes you wonder more and more what is real and what isn't. I do think this is a genre that is not used enough, like Constantine kind of thing. I like the idea of going into these occult worlds. Scott Bakula is a bit underrated, especially in this film. And I would also say that he is underrated in Star Trek Enterprise. I know a lot of people didn't like that series, but seeing what they've done with Star Trek over the last decade, I think if you go back and you watch that, you're like, wow, this is actually pretty good. In this film, he's got just enough of that down and out detective vibe, but charm, and he's kind of a sexy dude, I guess. So like he sells the I don't want to call it a romance necessarily with her, but this sexual tension that they have, I think it works. She's also a very beautiful person, so this could actually use a remake. I don't really like remakes, but if it was a bit darker and a little edgier, I think it actually could be quite good. One of the things that detracts from this is it's a little campy at times, and it's a little, some of the effects aren't that good, and it just feels very 90s. Doesn't really transcend its decade, I think. At number 7, we have Next from 2007, directed by Lee Tamahori and starring Nicolas Cage, Julianne Moore, and Jessica Biel. A sci-fi thriller based on the short story The Golden Man by Philip K. Dick. The film follows Chris Johnson, a man with the ability to see a few minutes into the future, who is pursued by FBI agent Callie Ferris to help prevent a catastrophic terrorist attack. As Chris grapples with the burden of his gift, he must navigate a complex web of danger and deception to alter the course of events and save countless lives. So this is based off a Philip K. Dick short story, and I love Philip K. Dick. If you've watched any of my other videos, you know I'm a big fan. This isn't his greatest film based off of his work, but there are some interesting things here, and it definitely works for this list. So Nicolas Cage's character can predict the next few minutes of his life. He's hiding in plain sight as this precognitive stage magician in Vegas. Through the film, we never really learn how he got his power. It's just kind of implied that he has it. We don't know if it's a supernatural power or if he just has heightened intuition, or it's some kind of unknown phenomenon. This ability is very inconsistent. Now, is this on purpose or not? They don't really say. They imply that the more important it is to his life, almost the further into the future he can see. But I suspect that this is more on purpose, that he doesn't want them to know how far into the future he can actually see, because then they're going to want to know all kinds of things. It's apparent he has some kind of ability. In the short story, it's established that this is a mutant. It's kind of like an evolutionary step. In the story, he has golden skin. It's very different than the movie. But in the movie, they leave it very ambiguous. If you had this power, what would you do? You can answer in the comments if you have some clever ideas. But how far would you lie to hide it? I don't know. If I had this power, I would definitely try to hide it. In fact, I don't even know if I would use it the way he did as a stage magician. I think I would just work at a gas station or something. I would do it something as far away from the reality of what I was so people wouldn't know. Then the question kind of pops up, if he has this and it's only 2 minutes in the future, can't he win the lottery? Or, there are all these other questions that I started thinking about when I was watching this. All in all, I think this is a watchable film. I don't think it's a great film. That's why it's so low on the list. But I do think it has enough ambiguity to fit on this list. Whether you would consider him a magician or not, I'm not sure. There are many ways to use magic, and I think precognition would be one. So in my way of seeing it, I think he is. I don't know. If you want to comment on that in the comments, you're welcome to do that. At number 6, we have Rasputin the Mad Monk from 1966, starring Christopher Lee, Barbara Shelley, and Richard Pascoe, and directed by Don Sharp. The film follows the rise of Grigory Rasputin, a sinister Russian mystic who gains influence over the royal family through his purported healing powers, leading to manipulation and terror within the court. As his power grows unchecked, those around him plot his downfall, culminating in a dramatic and bloody confrontation. So I love this film. I've loved this film for a long time. I have a bit of a backstory about it. I will say this though, before I get into it, it's not for everyone. He is quite intense in this movie, and it's definitely of its time. And maybe if I have female viewers, they might not appreciate it as much as the male viewers could, but I will say this. It is a hilarious film. I'm going to tell you a quick story surrounding this film. When I was in my early 20s, I worked at a company called Suncoast Motion Picture Company. And it was a video store. It must have been around 1992 or 93 maybe. It was kind of a thankless job because in order to work there, you had to have some knowledge of films, which I did. You know, a lot of the people that came in were like soccer moms and stuff because it was in a suburban mall. So you can imagine how frustrating that was for the people that worked there, because one of the things that they wanted us to do in the interview was show that we had all this knowledge. And then when we got there, you know, these moms came in asking for Disney films and whatever. So it was very frustrating for us. But one of the perks of working there is when new films would come out, new videos, we would be able to do a screener copy. So we can open up one and we'd be able to watch it in the store. Usually these films had to be PG or, you know, not a lot of problems that someone might complain about them. Because Rasputin was an older film, it was a film we could actually watch in terms of its content. Around that time, they released the Hammer Collection, which was like a widescreen re-release of all of the Hammer films. Well, we opened this film. I have a friend that I'm still friends with. We were both Christopher Lee fans, so we were like, well, we never saw this, let's put it on. Well, because it was such a crazy movie, we just played it over and over and over and over and over again. Every day we would play this film. There were other films around that time. We watched Top Secret, Caddyshack, many films we would watch, and we just play them every day. So the funny thing about it is I often would wonder, because when you play a movie, people will often buy the movie because they'll see it and they'll be like, oh, that looks pretty good. I never knew about that movie. I'll buy it. So I'm imagining like the accountants or, you know, higher up management in Suncoast looking at the Michigan store and being like, why is Rasputin the Mad Monk like so many sales in Rasputin the Mad Monk? But yeah, anyway, it just makes me laugh even thinking about it now. But Christopher Lee is perfection in this movie. I'm not saying he's like perfect with his, he doesn't even have a Russian accent. His delivery as the Mad Monk is just on point. If you don't know anything about Rasputin, he was a womanizer, a partier, a drunkard. Christopher Lee's delivery is amazing because he kind of like barks every line. Every line is like very forceful, and again, in real life, his powers are never really explained. He kind of blurs the line between having general spiritual powers and insight and being a manipulative charmer and womanizer. In the film, you're kind of seeing these two sides. So he kind of appears as like a villain or a saint, depending on how you look at it. I'm not going to give away any of the juicy parts about the film, but needless to say, it is just hilarious. It's like James Bond times 10 in terms of the womanizing department. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but in the context of this film, it's quite funny. You know, I mean, he looks terrible. He's got long hair, stringy, you know, he looks like an animal, and the way the women are just like fawning over him. And if you know anything about Hammer films, you know, it's a certain kind of lady that's in these films. And so just him walking through all of this and affecting all the women, it's just really funny to watch. It's the same kind of comical thing that would be in an older James Bond film, I guess. There are these uncertainties, you know, is he a con man? I don't know. There are a few scenes where Christopher Lee is almost channeling his Dracula shtick, and it's just hilarious, especially seeing him in this long beard and the stringy hair. It's just really funny. So Christopher Lee has this to say about his role. The only way you can present him is the way he was historically described. He was a lecher and a drunk and definitely had healing powers. So he was a saint and a sinner. There were very few good sides to him. Rasputin is one of the best things I've done, Christopher Lee said in Fangoria magazine. In the 1920s, Lee had actually met Rasputin's killer, Felix Yusupov, and later in life, Lee met Rasputin's daughter, Maria. So I find that very interesting that he kind of crossed paths with these people. But if you know anything about Christopher Lee, he actually knows quite a bit about the occult. I think him knowing those things actually helps with this role. It gives him some gravitas that if he didn't know those things, maybe it wouldn't work. But in this role, it definitely works. And yeah, this movie is a hoot. If you've never seen it and you're a Christopher Lee fan, you gotta watch this film. At number 5, we have Magic from 1978, directed by Richard Attenborough and starring Anthony Hopkins, Anne Margaret, and Burgess Meredith. A psychological horror thriller, the film is based on the novel of the same name by William Goldman and follows the story of a troubled ventriloquist named Corky who descends into madness as his sinister dummy, Fats, begins to take control. As Corky's grip on reality weakens, the line between man and puppet blurs, leading to a chilling climax of suspense and terror. So this is based off of a William Goldman story. If you know anything about him, he wrote The Princess Bride, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and The Stepford Wives, which is a pretty good resume. And I don't know if this film is as good as those 3 films, but it is interesting, and it definitely fits this list. Hopkins plays a neurotic comedian. He gets discovered by Burgess Meredith. You know, in the opening scene, he's kind of this bad card magician, and he bombs. And it's interesting, I guess this is a minor spoiler, but it doesn't really give too much away. It's interesting how in this one, I think the opening scene is great because he's telling his teacher how great the performance went, but it's actually showing the reality of how the performance went, which it did not go well. It's a good setup to kind of make him an unreliable narrator, and I think that really works later in the film because you're not really sure what's going on here, and I think that really helps the movie because at face value, this almost feels a little bit like a ripoff of The Twilight Zone. The movie cuts to like a year later, and he's a success. The house is packed. The same club that he was in the first time is now packed, and he's a hit. Burgess Meredith's character is bringing an investor there to kind of see this guy and how much of a success he is. Well, the difference between his first performance and the newer performance is that he has a dummy, and the dummy is the missing piece he did not have previously. The dummy is super creepy. If you know anything about the uncanny, automatons, dolls, all that kind of stuff just taps into a part of us that is just wrong. We don't respond well to them. It's almost like clowns. A lot of people hate clowns for a similar reason. Through the film, you're kind of guessing whether his ventriloquism is real or not, because sometimes, this is how well this film is directed, there are little touches where you're looking and you're like, is he really saying that? Because sometimes he's moving his mouth and sometimes he's not. And just enough to make you wonder, is this really, is the doll alive, or is the guy just making it, right? Making it work. So I will say that about this film, it definitely kept me guessing. I wasn't really sure. And there are different things that could be. The first is that the magician is insane, that he's just crazy, and that the doll and him have this odd relationship where he is taking his neurosis, like living his neurosis out through the doll. The second thing is that the dummy is alive. It's either haunted or anthropomorphic in some way, and that could be a possibility. The third is that the guy is using the dummy as a device for communicating with his higher self. In magic, they call that the holy guardian angel, or you could even say channeling a daemon, which is a spirit that's kind of part of yourself. You can look into those things if you want to know more about those things, but that was definitely something that crossed my mind when I was watching this. Is he doing that? Like, is this part of himself that he's kind of channeling or bringing forth? Well, I'm not going to tell you which one it is. If you want to watch the film and find out, the reveal is too juicy for me to spoil it here, so I'm not going to do that. But I will say that there are clues that kind of work for all three of my ideas. So I don't know. It's a nice setup to create doubt. About an hour and 25 minutes into it, the whole thing just shifts. And you're like, what? what just happened? And then it shifts again at the end. And there's kind of this sinister twist. And then I will say this, it eliminates all ambiguity once this last twist happens. But through the film, you're like, wait a minute, is this real magic or what the hell is going on? But I think it's quite successful. Now, is it the best film ever made? No. I think it has good performances. Anne Margaret is good in it. Actually, all the main leads are great in it. It is a bit of a precursor to Hannibal Lecter. Hopkins' nuances with his face kind of channel that performance a little. That's his all-time greatest performance, so there is something to be said about his performance here. But yeah, I think it's a worthy addition to this list. At number 4, we have The Illusionist from 2006, directed by Neil Berger and starring Edward Norton, Paul Giamatti, and Jessica Biel. A romantic mystery drama set in turn-of-the-century Vienna, the film follows Eisenheim, a master illusionist who uses his talents to reunite with his childhood love Sophie, now engaged to the ruthless Crown Prince Leopold. As Eisenheim's performances captivate audiences and challenge the authorities, a cat-and-mouse game with Chief Inspector Uhl ensues, leading to a stunning climax where illusion and reality blur. This is based off of a short story called Eisenheim the Illusionist by Stephen Millhauser. And I have not read the story, so I don't know how close it is to the actual short story or not, but I think the movie is pretty well done. The only problem is it came out the same year as another great magician movie, which I'll get to in a second. I think it kind of got overshadowed by this other film. The thing with this story is the illusions are so convincing that they blur reality. Now, you're not sure if the illusionist, played by Edward Norton, is so good with advanced technology because he does these drawings and things, so you kind of think that maybe he's just really good with creating these contraptions, or maybe he's just really good with sleight of hand, with skillful sleight of hand, or maybe he has supernatural powers. There's an early scene where the inspector is learning about him, and this scene creates doubt on whether he is supernatural or not. And I think this scene is so important because it just sets up the rest of the film, because you're wondering, is he supernatural or is he not? Is he a real magician or is this all just illusion? The great thing about it is he is a manipulator. He is a physical manipulator as well as a mental manipulator. He is super cunning and he is playing every person in this story to the point where you're not sure if he is able to create this ultimate plan, and does this ultimate plan only rely on his contraptions and sleight of hand, or does it rely on a mystical component, or is it just his intellect? It never really says. It was a box office success, despite the fact that this other film overshadowed it. The end makes this film, because similar to a film like Memento, once you know the end, then everything kind of falls into place. Yeah, I don't want to say what happens, but it does take away some of the ambiguity. But I think through the film, you're wondering, is he a real magician or is he not? But, even still, at the end, who's to say he's not? At number 3, we have Nightmare Alley from 2021, directed by Guillermo del Toro and starring Bradley Cooper, Cate Blanchett, and Rooney Mara. A dark psychological thriller based on the novel by William Lindsay Gresham. The film follows Stanton Carlyle, a charismatic but down-on-his-luck carnival worker who rises to fame as a mentalist by manipulating people with his cunning and charm. As he delves deeper into deceit and ambition, his life spirals into a dangerous game of cat and mouse with a mysterious psychologist, leading to a harrowing downfall. So there are actually two versions of this film. I watched both of them while preparing for this video. I'll say the newer version is better for several reasons, which I'll get into, but I'm going to have to give very minor spoilers if you haven't seen these films or read the book, and it's really only for the very beginning, but I need to talk about it to discuss the film in depth. So here's my theory. In the movie, Stanton Carlyle comes to this carnival, right? And he is in dire need of a job. He's kind of a carny. You're not really sure of his past. In the original film, they don't really give you any indication of his past. In the newer one, in this one, there's a scene where you realize he kind of did something shady, or you're not really sure what he did. So right away it creates some ambiguity, which is missing in the original film. I will say I think the original film is a bit more innocent. It obviously came out at a more innocent time, but they make him out to be a better person, I think, in the original film. In the remake, he is not a very good person. At the carnival, he meets these two characters, Zena and Pete, and they're kind of a couple, right? They do an act together. They are like supposed to be these mentalists. Well, my theory is that they are the real magicians, that Stanton Carlyle is a fake, a fraud. He actually encounters real magicians, but he doesn't realize it. And he uses the con game that they give him to go on his descent, let's say. The reason I believe this is because in Zena and Pete's act, they use this method called cold reading, which means that they can use this kind of code between them where it appears that they're reading someone's mind. He recognizes that this is a gold mine, because if you can do this, then you can manipulate and take it further. He kind of sees them as down and out, and I think a bit pathetic, because Pete is a alcoholic, and you know, they're at this kind of 2-bit carnival, so Stanton Carlyle, I think he just kind of looks down on them a bit and kind of uses them for this code. Well, in my theory, they give him the code because they don't want to give him real magic. And the reason I believe this is because there are a few clues. The first is Pete has this alcoholism, and I think he has it because he's carrying this burden. Something happened. Now, whether that has to do with their act or in the real world with his magic, I don't know, but you can definitely tell something broke him. In Zena's case, she uses these tarot cards all the time. They become these kind of omens, and I don't know, like, it just makes the movie better if they're real. Now, I'll get to why in a second. Eventually, he steals their act, and he kind of moves on to the big time. What happens is he is consumed by power. Perhaps that's what happened to Pete. Maybe that's why he has this burden, is he's already went through that cycle. I don't know. But the lure of money and his greed propels Stanton into this kind of Ponzi scheme, and I'm not going to say any more about the plot there because it gets very convoluted and very interesting, but it eventually leads to this lesson. I think the endings of these two films are quite different. I prefer the remake's ending, that's why it made the list. I do think there's some great things about the original. If you're a fan of the Criterion Collection, the original is part of the Criterion Collection. And I actually watched the original one first. And I thought, oh, this is really good. And then it got me to like it so much that I watched the remake, but then when I watched the remake, I actually thought the remake was better. One more thing I'll say about it is Willem Dafoe makes an interesting appearance in this film. It's not really a cameo, it's a bit bigger than that, but it is very cold and kind of, it just sort of shows the underbelly of this carny world. You know, if you know anything about Del Toro, he's perfectly suited for this kind of film. The production value in it is great, and I think that's something that's lacking a bit in the original. It looks a little bit too modest, whereas Del Toro's Carnival looks more exotic and just more interesting. The end of the remake is chilling, and it really stuck with me for days, even after seeing the original and knowing the end of that film, because I wasn't expecting this ending, and it works way better. And I suspect that this is the ending in the book, but I haven't read it, so I don't know. If you know and you want to comment on it, you can, but try not to give any spoilers in the comments, because I definitely think this is a film you should watch unspoiled. I know I gave a little bit at the beginning of this, but that's just a very small part of the story, so I think it was worth talking about to unveil the rest. At number 2, we have The Prestige from 2006, directed by Christopher Nolan and starring Hugh Jackman, Christian Bale, and Scarlett Johansson. A thrilling tale of rivalry and obsession in the world of stage magic. The film follows two magicians, Robert Angier and Alfred Borden, whose intense competition to create the ultimate illusion leads them down a dark path of deceit, sacrifice, and tragedy. So this is the film that overshadowed The Illusionist. And I love this film. I have seen this film so many times. If you like Nolan, you've probably seen it. If you haven't seen it, you should definitely see it. I'm going to try to talk about it without spoilers, but I'm going to have to say a few things, hopefully not too much. This film really grapples with the themes of obsession, sacrifice, and illusion. I think the magician in this film, just like the previous film on this list, is not the one that you think. It is not the two rivals, in my opinion. But they could be, also. It does leave some ambiguity there. I'm not going to say who I think the real magician is, but if you've seen this movie, you know. Please don't spoil it in the comments. I think the main thing about this film is whether advanced science is real magic when it comes in contact with the mundane world and the world of a certain time, especially if it's light years ahead of that time. That's a small part of this story. The real part of this story is obsession. This movie is all about obsession. The two main characters are totally obsessed with outdoing each other. Pride is also another aspect of this film. And also the lure of fame and competition. Those two things are very prevalent here. I also think this translates to real life, because I've seen it play out in many ways in the real world. Let's just say hypothetically that there are real magicians and they have powers of manipulation or powers of the occult, whatever. If they have these powers, should they use them? I think in a lot of these films it shows that maybe the burden is too large to use these powers. And maybe in some of these stories they touch on how powerful that can actually be and how destructive that can actually be. In the case of Pete and Xena from Nightmare Alley, I think that might be the case. In this film, I think the most important thing are the ethics. That is what is ultimately examined here. Do the two stage magicians sacrifice their ethics for the sake of outdoing each other? And there is a high personal cost, and that's a big twist in the movie. I'm not going to say what it is, but I do think in life that is also the case. I have seen things happen in my own life and also in the lives of others where there was wreckage, there was a burden. It doesn't mean diving into the occult or into magic is a negative experience. It has positives and negatives. I do think that there's a cost. Maybe that is the real lesson here in all these films, because I think in every one of these films there is a cost, and especially in this film. This film, the cost is very high. Also, in the number 1 film on this list, you can tell the cost is very high. I will say, at the end of this movie, it is a magic act in itself And a little bit like the Illusionist, once you go back through the story, you realize the director is a magician as well. He uses his ability to manipulate to get you to look over here when the reality is over here. So it's just a masterful direction, also masterful acting. I think along with The Fountain, I think this is probably one of Hugh Jackman's greatest performances. And Christian Bale rarely disappoints, and he's excellent in this. All of the supporting players are great in this. I don't think Scarlett Johansson is in it enough to really have too much of an impact, but Michael Caine is in it, and he's great as kind of the ethical pillar. But yeah, I think it's great, and it definitely deserves to be at number 2. So you're probably wondering now, what is number 1? Because I think a lot of people assumed this would be number 1. At number 1, we have The Magician from 1958, directed by Ingmar Bergman and starring Max von Sydow, Ingrid Thulin, and Gunnar Bjornstrand. A psychological drama that delves into the tension between faith and skepticism. The film centers on Dr. Vogler, a traveling illusionist and mesmerist whose mystical abilities are challenged by a group of rationalist officials. As the boundary between reality and illusion blurs, Vogler's performances reveal deeper truths about human nature and belief. The actual name of this movie is called The Face. It has a 100% Rotten Tomatoes score, which is impressive, and it's directed by Ingmar Bergman, which is probably, of the classic directors, my favorite director. He's best known for The Seventh Seal, Wild Strawberries, Persona, Hour of the Wolf, Through a Glass Darkly. I love all of his movies, but The Magician is my favorite film of his. It actually edges out Seventh Seal by just a tad. Like the other films on this list, it talks about the nature of illusion and magic and questions what is real and what is a trick. Vogler, who's played by Max von Sydow, he has these feats that defy easy explanation. I think he nails this role because he says very little. His silence speaks volumes. In the way that he plays it, he generates genuine fear and awe, not just in the audience, but in the characters around him. There's this mystical atmosphere that's prevalent through the whole film. And if you know anything about Bergman, his use of black and white is lush and almost delicious. I can't think of another word. Luscious. It's just beautiful. Actually, I think a lot of modern films could learn a lot from him because his films are almost more like stage plays. In fact, he worked in the stage. Like in The Seventh Seal, his use of the way that he makes death just this simple white face in a black cloak is just amazing. It doesn't take $100 million in CGI to do it. It's a guy in a black cloak. But it's the way that it's shot, it's the gravitas of the performers, it's the way the scripts are written. Modern films just don't know how to do that for some reason. They've been seduced by the effects, by the CGI, that they just don't know how to tell a simple story. Dr. Vigeris, played by Gunnar Bjornstrand, who's also in many of Bergman's other films, is the skeptic here, and he has this rationalism, and he's trying to find out how the tricks work, and he can't, and it's driving him crazy because he's a man of rational thought, and magic embraces the irrational, so it does not compute for him. And as the film goes on, there's this power struggle, this struggle for control between the illusionists' troupe and the town's authorities. I think one of the great things about this film is how it shows how outsiders are questioned and shunned and just not accepted in small places, small towns, small communities, small groups. Part of it has to do with their exoticness and the magician's strange powers. A lot of it has to do with their identity and the mystery surrounding them and the roles that people play in society. I think this is the best film for sure about a real magician hiding in plain sight. Because I actually think in this film he's supposed to be a real magician. There's no doubt. They create this ambiguity, but in my mind, the way that it's played by Max von Sydow, I think there's just too much burden here. He can't be fake. It's just not the way that it could be. And I think that is the point of the true title of this film, The Face. It's the face that he wears, but it's not the reality of his life. I'm going to say Bergman always delivers. I think he's better than Hitchcock. I think he's better than Kurosawa. I know that might be sacrilege to say, but I love his films. Now, don't get me wrong. There are many Hitchcock films I like. There are many Kurosawa films I love, but I just think Bergman is very consistent. His films speak to me. It might be because of what they're about. I'm not sure, but I feel like his films align similarly to the works of Hermann Hesse, the writer. I don't know. There's something about his books that just speak to me as well. And I don't know. If you haven't seen his film and you're a fan of Hesse, you'll probably love it, because it's all about the struggle of spirit and the idea of imagination over mundane life and what you make of your life through transformations and all these things. But that's all I got. That's my list. If you have anything to say about any of these films, please try not to spoil them, though, because I think a lot of these have really strong twists, and I tried really hard not to give it away. If you have anything to say, leave that in the comments. If you know anyone that might benefit from it, you can share it. If you want to hit the bell and like it if you want, I would appreciate it. It helps my channel. My next top 10 list is going to be top 10 neo-noir films. And then I think I'm going to do top 10 individualism books, I think. Books on individualism. So that will be my next list, but that might not be for a bit because these take a while to produce. So that's all I got. Have a good day. Take care.